Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country and around the world, the Super Bowl is coming soon, but the Super Bowl of politics and national security is long since upon us. And I am very happy to be bringing a true American hero, somebody I've admired, somebody we've covered on this show, and someone I've been really looking forward to having a conversation with, a guy who is a primetime quarterback who continues to rise to the moment for America and for freedom. The great and powerful Colonel Alex Vindman is finally on Independent Americans. Welcome, sir.
Thanks for having me on. Frankly, I'm eager to talk to you for a couple of different reasons. Turns out that we almost crossed paths. You were an OCS graduate back in 2001, and I was coming back from Korea, and I started my assignment at OCS. I was, like out of nowhere. I was supposed to go to the airborne school and be an instructor there, and pick up some cool badges, get a bunch of jumps. But they sent me off to the OCS, and I got there in September. So probably right after you left.
Wow, that is a cool
But
overlap. I think.
that's one. The other ones are, frankly, you're talking to independents, which is probably going to be the decisive constituency in 2024. They certainly showed their strength in, I think, New Hampshire, in my opinion, in my analysis. It was the independents that closed what was supposed to be a yawning gap between Trump and any of his other challengers, and independents delivered for Nikki Haley. They are not interested in MAGA or Trump, which is good. And then you also talk to veterans and first responders, and sometimes I'm not sure if I get the warmest reception. I do work for a veterans group also, but those are my people, career public servants. So again, happy to talk to you, and happy to reach out to your audience.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. It's definitely a supportive audience, and I've admired your heroism and your courage and your voice for a long time. We covered it on this show when you were still on active duty, and we were, supporting. I think "Thank you, Colonel Vindman" was the hashtag that I was kicking out there, and I went back and looked at it because we were tracking and covering your story throughout that. And I want to get into that. I want to get into Ukraine. I want to get into the attacks on the U.S., maybe even get your Super Bowl predictions. But we also had a great connection. Your wife put us in touch. Thanks to the magic of X, Twitter. There's a lot of downsides to it. You and I have both been vocal about that. But one of the good sides is your wife was able to connect us. And then you met my wife at Sundance last week,
Yeah.
which is got to be wild. But let me start by asking you the question I ask everybody. Alex, where are you and how are you?
I'm in, well, I just flew back in from up north. I'm in South Florida. I'm a recent transplant. I think you have connections down here too. We moved down here in March of last year for a couple of different reasons. Frankly, it turns out I'm more of a warm weather guy. I spent my life in, like, cold places like Korea, Germany, Russia, Ukraine, at various embassies. But it turns out that I thrive in warm weather. So, enjoying South Florida, but traveling a lot. And it's been lovely here. So in general, good. Super, super busy, but good.
I was going to save this for later, but maybe you can run for office down there. I know your brother's running in Virginia, but maybe you could run against DeSantis or something statewide down there. What do you think?
That's a tough one. I think the fact is that probably I'd be divorced if that happened. My wife Rachel is not interested in that. And frankly, I think I'm doing a lot of good on the outside. I'm certainly helping my twin brother run for Virginia 7. His district is going to be absolutely critical to turning the House Dem to keeping it in MAGA hands. And, people haven't really thought about it so much, but in the closest of scenarios in which basically Trump and Biden somehow get equal electoral college votes, it would get kicked over to the House.
Mm-hmm.
And this would be in the House gets sworn on the 3rd of January, and you have basically the certifications occur right thereafter. So it would be the new House, potentially a Democratic House that would be making those decisions instead of this craziness that we have right now in Washington, D.C. So I think it's a long way of saying I think I could do a lot of good on the outside. I work for Vote Vets as a senior advisor, so helping veterans get elected to office. It's not just veterans, actually, it's career public servants. So And we've got former CIA officers, we've got State Department folks, we've got DoD civilians, all sorts of different folks. And then I also run a national security and defense think tank in Vote Vets, and that's why you see me in the news media writing on this topic and engaging with decision makers to try to provide some counsel, which they usually dismiss. But uh,
I think America's listening, and I've been thankful for your voice. It's been like a conscience. But I got to ask you, you've been on such a wild and interesting journey. You, your wife, your brother. I mean, you go from immigrating to Brooklyn to the army to Sundance Film Festival and an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm. I mean, it's I had a very similarly weird experience back in 2004 when I challenged George Bush in the war, but it was a very different time. It was a very different experience. But can you talk about what that's been like to being, a dedicated soldier? We were in, I think, Fort Benning in Iraq around the same time. And
sure.
then you're literally doing a cameo in Curb Your Enthusiasm, which was amazing, by the way. And I celebrate. I said, "Holy shit, it's Vindman. This is great." But that's a very surreal experience to go through. Can you talk about what that's been like for you?
I guess to a certain extent, I think there's a couple of different things that kind of weigh in on why some of these things kind of wind up in my background in my biography. First of all, I think I tend to be a little bit less risk averse. I'm open to new experiences. I like to travel. I like to try new things. And there was an instinct against initially about against doing Curb Your Enthusiasm. It was like too off brand, just fresh out of the military kind of kind of thing is that to do. And then that episode itself was a bit weird, but it was good. It was fun. And I'm glad I did it. I did it in part because actually we had a brand new niece out there and we hadn't visited and they were flying me out there. So that was cool, a twofer. But in general, I tend to be, again, a little bit more. I've got a higher risk tolerance. I think it's more that I calibrate risk more finely, like mensurate, as we say in the military,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore I could give myself larger parameters for making some decisions. And then that part of that's I think family DNA. I think my family has an interesting background. I talked about it in my book. My dad survived. He's 91, be 92 this year. He survived the war. The family fled. They lived. He grew up in the Soviet Union and managed to work his way up into positions of authority. He started over as a 47-year-old. So I think there's a combination of nature and nurture, like
Mm.
what was in the DNA and kind of about my own experiences and how I live that allow me to do all these weird things. But it is very surreal,
Mm.
smoking cigars with Arnold Schwarzenegger at his home for a couple hours. Not something I would have expected. Curb Your
Well,
Enthusiasm,
I'm glad
Sundance.
you're in those places because
Yeah,
people need to hear from you. And sometimes, those crossovers are what break through the most. And I don't know if you're going to have a cameo in the final season of Curb Your Enthusiasm coming up or not. Wink, wink. Yeah, no spoilers. Uh, but I think we're going to need Curb because the world is on fire and we need humor and some perspective and a laugh once in a while. But what's going on in the world is no laughing matter. Part of
oh,
why you were at Sundance is for this new film,
yeah,
War Game, right? Which is a simulation of what could happen after 2004, right? And you guys
yeah,
are in a simulated war room with Wes Clark and Heidi
yeah,
Hellcamp and others. But
yeah,
the question I was going to ask you is, you've been so vocal and powerful and important on Ukraine. We're at this point now where it feels like the real fight for Ukraine is actually not in Ukraine, it's in the American Congress. And it feels like Ukraine is losing. You've
yeah.
been outspoken about what more Biden could do, what more NATO could do, what more Congress can do. But can you lay out, maybe with clarity for folks that might not be as deep into it as you are, what does it look like if we continue on this course and if the GOP led Congress pulls the plug on Ukraine? What happens to the world if that happens?
Yeah. So it's at the base level, especially for the soldiers out there, it just means a lot more bloodshed, a lot more Ukrainians dying, longer war, a lot more civilians dying, because Russia is not restrained in prosecuting war against the military. It's certainly very, very actively trying to terrorize the population and cow the population into submission. So that's the kind of on just a human level that's part of the picture. I think it's also very, very dangerous for the US from a national security perspective. This war was going to be tough. 20 sorry, this year was going to be tough. 2024 was going to be tough. Reason is that Russia, is about 3.5 times the size, has an economy, somewhere in the ballpark of almost 10 times the size of Ukraine's, and they shifted to war footing. About 40% of the state budget is now oriented on the war. That's an enormous amount of spending. That's the sum total of everything that the US provided, the EU provided, all the donors provided, plus what Ukraine is spending on this war. Russia is now spending by itself. So it's a massive, massive expenditure. And what they're doing is they're reinvesting back into their massive military industrial base. They had a enormous capacity, a war-making capacity in the Soviet Union. Some of that wheeled back, some of it atrophied, but they're now putting resources back in, having a hard time really producing high end, top quality gear. They could do it in low quantities because they could steal, components from the West, but they can't produce them in massive numbers. But what they can do is renovate the old Soviet stuff and put it back into working order. And then they're mobilizing thousands of troops a month, tens of thousands of troops a month. And that's a recipe for a very, very difficult war. On the Ukrainian side, it's a problem in that they have not really kind of shifted to war footing. They have not energized the industrial base in the same way. They haven't really mobilized significantly. They have basically a prohibition on anybody below the age of 27 serving because they want those young men to have a life before they risk their lives in combat. But that's not the way you fight a war to win. The training has been inadequate. I think the U.S. plays a role in that, and we focused on frontline troops. What you would understand as battle drills. Kind of just the basics: shoot, move, communicate. Not what you need to win modern wars. What's required is combined arms, being able to orchestrate artillery, air defense, armor, infantry, all of that together engineers at a specific point in order to achieve your decisive effects, win. And that's not happened. Logistics massively lacking. We've provided them thousands and thousands of pieces of equipment, but without the warranty, without the repair parts to be able to sustain them. It's actually in a lot of ways it's a bit of negligence. So this was going to be a tough year. It becomes that much more difficult when you don't have the U.S. in the game. The U.S. is referred to as the arsenal democracy. We have the most powerful military in the world, the most powerful industrial base to support the military, and there is no combination of countries that could fill the gap of the U.S. absence. So what that means, and I think the Europeans are going to try. They're putting in additional resources. By the way, I think your audience should know that the Europeans have actually spent more money than the U.S. They just spend it differently. They provide budget support. They provide humanitarian assistance. They don't have the means to do military assistance, but they provided more billions than we have. And the other kind of little known secret, I'll be writing about this in more detail, is frankly, this war has been a huge, huge uh, boon to the U.S. military industrial complex. It has been, it is almost a dream come true. Losing from a geopolitical standpoint, it's a disaster. But from a very kind of bureaucratic military perspective, it's a dream come true. Because what the military has been doing is been shifting off all its old broken stuff that they would have to then spend money to like recycle, get rid of. They've given it away, and one for one almost, they've gotten brand new shiny stuff off the production lines. The best gear. And this has been the big long-term reset, 20 years of war. It's that we've not really conducted a reset. This is the reset on the backs of the Ukrainians fighting for democracy around the world. So there's a lot of different things that we should have been doing all along. The minimum is passing Ukraine supplemental, even in our imperfect way, with all these deficiencies that I made, slow support, very, very incremental. We at minimum should at least sustain it because otherwise it really starts to look really it could be disastrous. It's unlikely that Ukraine is going to fold. Very, very unlikely. The Russians don't have the strength to overwhelm the Ukrainians, but they can take additional territory. They can inflict a lot of casualties, and they can extend the war and set conditions for maybe a compromise where the Ukrainians have to give up large chunks of territory. And all that does is, delays another round of war between Russia and Ukraine and a war between the U.S. and Europe and Russia.
Alex, you set the landscape well. I think you set what the future can look like well. You've been, consistent in pulling apart what's most important during the various evolutions of this war. I have said, Biden has been putting Ukraine and Zelensky in this game of Mother May I for far too long, where it's a piece here, a piece there, everything from the HIMARS to the F-16s. It's the drip, drip, drip strategy, which I think has really hamstrung the Ukrainians. But obviously, Biden and Trump will have very different approaches to Ukraine. But America is not really great at supporting our own wars for very long, right?
Yeah.
They feel you and I saw that serving in the Middle East in the last 20 years. It feels like America is tired of this war. The repeated attacks from right-wing media, from presidential candidates, the distractions on the border, and all these other arguments have kind of worn down public support. It almost mirrors Biden, right? It feels like they're getting beaten up, they're getting worn out, and it doesn't have the energy and popularity it used to have. How do we win the political battle
Yeah.
to support Ukraine? If Ukraine is a political candidate that's way down in the polls and we need Ukraine to win, how do we in America move opponents of Ukraine to support Ukraine to victory politically?
So you're right. Ukraine is not the shiny thing. It's not stealing the airways the way it was for the first 6 months. And I think the fact is the media shifted off Ukraine as a topic,
Yeah.
shifted over to a busy domestic agenda, all the Trump scandals, the indictments, now an election. I think the American public actually still continues to support Ukraine. It's just the support is softened, and it's not really. It's not. Nobody's tried to harness it. If frankly Biden didn't have an election year, he probably would be maybe he could do a better job of harnessing it. And right now he's focused on the most important thing, which is keeping our democracy safe, which means winning the 2024 election. So I understand to a certain extent, this year has a lot of competing challenges. Ukraine has to be one of them. I think the fact is that the kinds of things that kept the attention on Ukraine early on were atrocities committed by Russia. They're still occurring. So we could almost guarantee that Russia is going to do something heinous, and it'll be back in the news cycle for bits of time. And we have to have powerful voices like your voice constantly talking about the fact that this is not a far off war. What happens in Ukraine actually is affecting us today. If you think about it, the reason that we had that a pretty decent surge in regards to inflation was in part COVID. It was supply chain issues, but it was also Russia. Basically Putin was charging us all a tax. He was charging us oil and gas taxes because he disrupted the oil and gas markets. He was charging us, food taxes because it was a shock to the world food market, losing access to grains from Ukraine. It's the breadbasket of not just Europe but of the world. So I think the fact is that it's affecting our lives. And if you ask almost all Americans, minus the really hardcore MAGA, I think, and you ask the question of, do you support the aspirations of a democracy struggling to fend off, an authoritarian regime? They would say invariably yes. Now, if you put in like Russia and Ukraine, that answer changes because of the way our politics have been polarized, and that you have one man that loves his dictators. Donald Trump loves his dictators, and he's a huge cheerleader for Vladimir Putin, and he feels slighted by Ukraine because they didn't bend to his will, and that was a factor in his first impeachment. So he's basically a vengeful, he's a vengeful, hateful individual. I think is I don't think those are extremes. I think those are pretty accurate definitions. So I think he favors the authoritarian as opposed to democracy, and that changes the responses you get from from MAGA folks. But otherwise, you take those names out, and I think you get large support. But I mean, look, the reality is this is 2024. This election is going to be about our whether we have a democracy in 2025. We have a very, very, very busy geopolitical landscape. In a lot of ways, probably the most complex in our lifetimes, or at least in our adult lifetimes. Since the post Cold War era. Yes, we had two wars in the Middle East, but in a lot of ways, those were kind of simple. We were fighting global war on terror. We have a conflict in the Middle East that looks like it's boiling over. We just had an unfortunate series of casualties in in Syria on the border with Jordan. I'm pretty well familiar with that place. I mean, it came to my attention when I was in the Pentagon and managing the relationship with Russia after they involved themselves in Syria. And we spilled blood there before on several occasions. That the all the disruption in commercial shipping in around the Arabian Peninsula, what looks like could be a broadening conflict with the Houthis, and then of course you've got North Korea watching out what's going on. Iran, doesn't want to provoke the U.S. directly, but we might stumble into a conflict. And if we fail in all these places and in Ukraine, the Chinese are right there trying to figure out how to crush Taiwanese democracy. They just had a powerful election. They voted for a pro-democracy candidate that was, unbending to Chinese intimidation, and that is, frankly, that could be a game changer if the Chinese at some point smell blood in the water and step in, and there's a militarized effort to subdue Taiwan. The U.S. would get involved, and then you have the world entirely at war.
Alex, can we build on that, because you took us to the Red Sea and the attacks on U.S. troops, which I think are really important. I wanted to go there. We've covered it on this show. Now we're over 130 attacks on U.S. troops. It was only a matter of time, unfortunately, before American service members have died. Now they have. I think part of why I and so many other people respect you is because you're willing to call out the Democrats and Biden, right? You're not just falling in lockstep. I don't know. I assume you're a Democrat, but I almost wish you were. I do wish you were an independent. I wish your brother was running as an independent, because I feel like so many folks just fall in line with the Democratic Party and with Biden in particular. But you've called him out, and on Ukraine and other areas. You said the Chinese will pounce if they smell blood in the water. Do our enemies smell blood in the water because Biden's too passive? Is he too slow to respond? Whether it's Afghanistan, then it's Ukraine, now it's the Houthis, maybe it's China. Is he just too slow to respond too consistently in a way that jeopardizes our national security, but also, frankly, doesn't play well politically at home?
Yeah. Well, I think, frankly, his biggest shortfall right now is the perception of his age and senility. And if he demonstrated vigor, if he was out there, in Colorado at Sundance, or actually in Utah at Sundance skiing on the ski slopes, that would be a pretty darn powerful image. Having him vigorous and involved, and not being managed by a staff, which is a lot of what's going on is being managed by a staff. He actually has pretty good instincts. I mean, the guy doesn't, if you catch him talking about things, he's pretty aggressive. I think, it's that kind of Northern Pennsylvania Catholic type of swagger he's got going on or something. So I think the problem is that he gets rain. He even though he's the president, he has large teams around him that, in a way try to manage him and wheel him back. And I think he needs to be himself. And I think if that was the case, he'd come across better to the American public. In terms of whether our adversaries smell blood in the water, I think yes. They sense, there's almost a thread that can the U.S. actually win a war? Is the U.S. capable of winning a war? And it's not just a Democrat thing; it's a Republican thing. Frankly, we had multiple different administrations involved in 20 years of war, and none of them could really quite figure it out. Iraq hasn't completely crumbled like Afghanistan. It actually is still, somewhat of a functioning democracy that in certain regards has to appease Iran, its powerful neighbor, but still acts independently oftentimes, but has, large Shia populations and things of that nature. So I think we probably do need to be, and it doesn't mean that we need to wage war constantly. It doesn't mean that we need to attack anybody that slights us, like an erratic, crazy man like Donald Trump might do. Take the scenario, the throwaway scenario that gets proposed to him, and say that's the one I want to go with. That's not what we need. We need somebody, a steady, capable individual. But we probably do need to act with some sort of vigor and recognize that
Mm.
there is a growing threat. The perceptions of U.S. strength, regardless of the fact that we have this massive economy that's chugging along like a train that just won't stop. We have the most powerful economy and growing faster than any other economy in the world. Gap growing between us and the Chinese. They're not missing that, and that's
Mm-hmm.
that's a basis for U.S. power. But in a lot of other ways, we seem unable to act. Our politics seem paralyzed. We're not able to make decisions on our own national security interests. So I think there is some of that. But I guess, I it appeals to me to also, kind of not be beholden to one side or the other. I still consider myself a free agent, but we have a two-party system. The election in 2024 is going to be between a Democrat and a Republican. We can't, frankly, have anybody else in there because the margins are going to be so thin. And if you take a look at between somebody that's done in a lot of ways superbly, and I think Americans might disagree, but if you think about the long-term investments Biden's done for the U.S. economically, infrastructure, Inflation Reduction Act, and things of that nature, these are CHIPS Act. These are long-term investments and basically bringing back manufacturing to the U.S. He's done great there. I think foreign policy could definitely be more muscular in defending U.S. interests. That would be good for our allies. That would warn off our adversaries. But if you look at the flip side and what would happen if you had a Trump come in, it would be an absolute disaster. Almost could be forgiven for electing Trump once.
Mm.
We would lose all the trust and confidence of the entire world, of allies, and frankly, probably of our adversaries also. And they'd see it as an opportunity to, um, you know, to extract whatever they wanted to. All they would have to do is cater to Trump's vanity, and they could get away with almost whatever they wanted to, because that's the way he's easily manipulated.
Alex, I think you're right on so much of that, and I think most independents see it the same way, and many of them maybe are coming over, or maybe they won't come over till they flip that switch. And I think you're right. We've talked about it on the show about the threat of a third party candidate at the presidential level. But where I see the opportunity is down ballot, right? You represent this kind of new generation of national security experience leaders. Like Amy McGrath has been on this show. We've had other folks on this show that kind of represent the next generation. Wes Moore, the governor of Maryland, right? Now, there's also an opportunity to move the Democratic Party in a better direction, but also to leave the Democratic Party. So if a guy like you runs as an independent, say, for Senate against Marco Rubio, I think we've got a very interesting scenario here. Do you see any interest from yourself, and in particular, generals coming out of the military, colonels coming out of the military, somebody like a Mark Milley? I've made the argument we need them in politics,
Yeah.
but they don't want to get into politics. Does an independent, unaffiliated option offer a pathway for people like you in a place like Florida, or a person like Milley in another environment, down ballot, not for president, but for governor, for
Yeah.
Senate, for Congress?
So let me just set aside the whole question of whether it's me or not. I guess I think people would be data driven and have to understand how you overcome the massive barriers of the party systems, and they work their way down to states. That's how fundraising basically is organized through the parties. There is no fundraising apparatus for independence. You could try to do a grassroots campaign. Frankly, my twins' campaign is very, very grassroots. I mean, he's gotten 60,000 donations from across the country. So maybe with the very right person, you might be able to do that kind of fundraising game. But you would have to overcome a huge barrier in terms of the two-party system. And the important thing, frankly, between having at least two parties that function is that there's an exchange of ideas. You have one party that, is on the left, one party is on the right. That's fine. The population could, move between those two, but you have to have at least two parties because right now, let's say if it was a functional Republican Party, if it was a Reagan Republican Party, they would be highly critical of what they would say would be insufficient support to Ukraine. And on that basis, they would make a case to the American public that we need to do better in terms of protecting our interests abroad. That's not the way elections are usually won, but they could make that case. And we don't have that right now. You basically have you fall in line with the Democratic Party because that at least you have a democracy and they're imperfect, but things are not going to completely fall apart. And frankly, if they're successful in 2024, at least you have a Ukraine supplemental. If the Republican Party wins, and guess what? There's not going to be a Ukraine supplemental. There's not going to be additional aid to Israel. There's not going to be additional aid to Taiwan. There's probably there might be a war with Mexico. Who knows? I mean, crazy stuff. Like we might start nuking hurricanes or something. I don't know. So, I mean, we're so far afield that this conversation in a different context might make a lot more sense. But in this, the peril of the moment where everything is all in on, preserving our democracy, I think it's really not necessarily the right time. So why don't we have this conversation?
Let's put a pin in it, right? Yeah. Let's put a pin in it because if there is a surge of independent candidates who can create a fundraising network that's led by former military folks, because in a place like Florida, you probably can't win as a Democrat right now, but you might be able to win as an independent, right? Well, I mean, maybe not you, but someone, right? If The Rock goes home I always use him as the example, right? If The Rock goes home to Miami and decides to run against Marco Rubio, he could run as a Green Party candidate, and I'd still be betting on him to win, right?
I think you're right, but I would say that your point on military, public servants, first responders, those folks running for office is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
They are perceived as honorable. They're perceived as oath keepers in the proper sense.
Right.
That, they will live up to their obligations to support and defend the Constitution. That they are not going to be, purely self-seeking and self-enriching. And I think, that is why I actually work with Vote Vets, because I think, we have a awesome group of candidates that we support across the country. These are all not, radical. We don't have radical Democrats. We have moderate Democrat, pro-national security, not like regressive in their thinking about social issues and stuff like that. I mean, frankly, probably like in a lot of ways, the independents would be highly supportive of these folks, and I think part of that.
But they are all Democrats, right? I mean, maybe there's a place in the future where Vote Vets and others would actually support an independent candidate. I don't know if there's a world where that exists, but I think that's what folks are hoping for. I think many folks are hoping that somebody will step up. If use you as an example, if a guy like you said, you know what, I'm not going to run as a Democrat, I'm going to run as an independent. Who's going to support me, right? Like I think there's special leaders that can that can bust this paradigm, and I'm always advocating for them. We've had them on this show. I mean, Barry McCaffrey came on and told me he might run for mayor against Eric Adams here in New York. He's so frustrated by the situation, but it's a time that I think celebrates and requires leaders, and you're one of them. You're generously gonna stick around. So Patreon members, you're going to get some extra content with the Colonel. Stick around for that. We'll go back to the car question and a couple of the other classics for our dedicated Patreon members. But a final question for you, sir. Wrap it all up. Let's talk about a different kind of battlefield. Super Bowl's coming up next week. We got Kansas City versus San Francisco in this epic clash. Who are you picking and why?
Okay, so first of all, I do have to second your nomination for The Rock to run down here. He'd have my vote. By the way, supposedly his mother lived in my neighborhood, my subdivision, some like houses down. So
excellent.
A long time ago. So I for whatever reason, I always had a kind of affinity for the 49ers growing up. I grew up in New York City, so I like the Giants. But if it wasn't the Giants, then I really like the 49ers for a long time. But you know what? I think I might have to go with St. Louis, because of Taylor Swift. You know,
St. Louis. Yeah.
Taylor
Kansas
Swift
City. Yeah. Yeah. But you're
Kelsey.
right there. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm with you on that. I'm
I
with
mean,
you on that.
what kind of madman would go against Taylor Swift
Look,
and
I've
Kelsey?
always been using The Rock as the example, but if Taylor Swift ran for office, who wants to run against Taylor Swift for anything? You can
What?
hate on her all you want, but you put her in any race in America to include for president. I
Yeah.
mean, this
So
is this
that's
shows
right.
like the paradigm busting potential that certain people have, right?
I think this is the what I'm joking a bit. I think frankly I think the Cardinals probably might have it, but I did want to make a point about the fact that like what kind of madman is running the Republican Party where they have a women problem where they can't get women to show up for them, and then they attack Taylor Swift. I mean, what kind of madman comes up with that
And
strategy?
Jason, and look, by default, the Kelsey brothers, who are
Yeah.
like the ultimate populist candidate. I had
Yeah.
Smirkanich on last week. We talked about Jason Kelsey as a political candidate in Pennsylvania and how well he would do. I mean, you put Jason Kelsey and Taylor Swift up on any platform, they're going to crush everybody. You get every demographic. You get all the young women, and you get the old white dads and everybody who plays football and watches
Yeah.
football. I mean, if you could get the NFL and Taylor Swift, that's maybe the two most powerful voting demographics in America, right?
Well,
That's horsepower.
daughter fathers, are also supportive
That's
of
it, right?
it.
Well,
She
listen, man,
almost gave me my testimony, actually.
I'm I'm grateful for all your leadership. You're going to stick around for some extra content, but I really hope you will come back again. It's been way too long since we finally had you on the show. I'm grateful that you're here, but in all sincerity, you're a true American hero. You're a role model. You speak truth to power. You're the kind of leader that this moment requires, and it's a true honor to finally have a conversation with you and know that me and so many others had your back when you were in uniform and have your back now and are rooting for you forever. So thank you for all your leadership and for embodying what true patriotism is all about.
Thank you, Paul.
All right. Stay vigilant, my friend.